All right. Welcome to the conversation.
All right, great. So this was actually initiated by me after I had a conversation with Zack. So Zack saw at least one video of mine. I don't know the full backstory, but a video where I was talking about trying to think through the question of what is going on in this aspect of the technical economy called the NFT space. I've been thinking about that a lot. And I had the insight of invoking a theory of scenius. So I spoke about NFTs in relationship to the notion of scenius. Zack, I presume saw that.
Can you say NFT for those of us that are not in the know?
It refers to the concept and the technology of non-fungible token, which for those who are not in the know is just kind of like the near the front edge right now of what's happening in the category of something called the blockchain. Right. So
that I know.
The blockchain is
I'm there.
Deeper. Yeah.
Okay.
So, Zack's background in generative anthropology caused him to reach out to me. And so we had a conversation like 2 days ago. And in the context of that conversation, I was like, okay, there's a lot of interesting coordination between Greg's work and the field of generative anthropology, which is nice because from my point of view, Greg has never heard of GA and vice versa. So convergent evolution is always a very nice thing. And so that it was strong enough, possibly just because of my taking of coffee before the conversation, but we'll find out, that my system said, hey, let's make this, let's accelerate a three-man chat on this thing.
I'll say right away, I'm really glad you did. It's already been fruitful. I popped into generative anthropology and just was immediately taken with the brief description, in part because I had encountered René Girard and liked some of what he said. And in fact, I was just telling Zack a little bit about this. There were a couple of key pieces from where I sit. So René Girard, really a philosopher trying to give us a particular frame on the human social condition as a grounding in sort of mimesis, which is fundamentally mimicry and shared group attention, intention. And he then emphasizes desire as emerging out of this intersubjective shared domain, which is actually very powerful and something I can relate to. However, Girard emphasizes certain features of it. Basically, especially he comes off and identifies the scapegoat mechanism in certain cultures, because the way in which you then have to channel conflict around mimicry, we can get into the specifics, but then that yields a particular resentment and conflict, and then that yields violence, and then the system has to hold violence in a particular way, and that can manifest in relationship to the scapegoat. That's some of his core insights, at least insights that I encountered pretty early in my survey of his work, which I thought was really powerful and interesting. I hadn't really had a good formulation, rich formulation of scapegoating per se. I hadn't really looked. It was rich. However, as a generalized theory of human motivation, social motivation, desire, the evolution from our primate ancestors into our personhood, I wasn't terribly impressed with it. It overshot in relationship to its generalizability, in my estimation, and it missed a lot of nuance. In particular, there are other motives, love and gratitude. There's also this question about the origin of language and the jump into language relative to our pre-linguistic intersubjective space, and then down before that in our animal space, and how to chart all that shit. Well, I popped into generative anthropology, read the first 1 minute overview, and then read the deep interval. I was like, those are the goddamn pieces I said we're missing. So I was like, fuck, that's wonderful. And voila, I'll shut up there, but just say I immediately was excited about it.
Yeah, no, Greg, I mean, I think you're pointing out exactly some of the kind of hesitations I had about Girard as well. And, my background is very much in Girardian thought. And I want to draw on one thing you said right there, where you said there's all these things that Girard sort of doesn't really speak to, things like love, for example. I mean, the name of the blog of Eric Gons, who's the founder of Generative Anthropology, and maybe interestingly, anecdotally, the first PhD student of René Girard. I mean, his blog is titled Chronicles of Love and Resentment. I mean, one of the kind of key moves that generative anthropology makes in distinction to Girard is the human is founded on nonviolence as opposed to violence in GA's perspective. So it's actually the deferral of violence that makes the human being possible. And we're always working within this kind of semiotic system where we're deferring violence through language understood in a very deep sense that means something almost more like religion, sacrality. It's not simply words in the way we might kind of conventionally think about it. So I just want to say that I think you kind of point out exactly some of the flaws in Girard that I was nervous about. And I think there's a lot that GA can do to kind of heal some of those wounds maybe and give us a lot more to say.
I certainly felt that in my summary of it. It's great.
Cool.
So I'm curious, what's the best move now? I'm noticing like 3. One might be for you guys to just kind of shoot the shit for a while and do a little bit of a checksum on unifying, like basically create symmetry in the triangle. The second would just be to assume symmetry in the triangle and jump from the center into a pyramid. And the third would just be to go straight to teleportation speed and start streaming straight from the other side of the joint point, which of course is my preference, but oftentimes ends up being confusing.
Why don't we assume symmetry? I think we're all sort of aware of it, and part of the inquiry into generative anthropology, as you go into it, you're sort of reconstituting the explanation itself. It's a little bit paradoxical, but I think we'll see as we get into it, and so I think that's the best way to proceed. But
I think that's great. I would benefit, and I'd be happy to share from a little bit more perspectival orientation from you, Zach, in terms of what you're seeing and what generative anthropology brings to the potentiation of the 5th joint point, or whatever.
Sure.
Dimension.
Let me say a little bit, because I've read some of your work now. Thank you, Jordan, for sharing that, and thank you for developing that website. It's really, really wonderful. I think one of the things that you point out to that is exactly, you're sort of hitting the nail on the head, is, and I think I'm quoting from you here. Maybe I don't have it exactly, but you said something like where nature and culture sort of meet, everything kind of breaks down. This is kind of one of the problems you note in psychology, is how do you kind of make that integration? I mean, this is, I think, where GA is in some sense the strongest. The claim that GA kind of hypothesizes is that the origin of language is sort of a difference in category from almost anything else in the universe, in the sense that it was an event. Eric Gons has even called it the little bang, kind of alluding to the big bang of the universe, the little bang of the human and of language. And so this kind of eventual origin, or this eventual anthropogenesis of the human being, is radically unique. It's transcendent, and it sort of initiates and gives birth to this world of signs that we are still a part of today. And so this eventual origin is going to be very important. And generative anthropology is a theory of sort of how that emerged. It's leaning on mimesis from Girard, and a notion of difference that's pulling from Derrida. And and so maybe I'll stop there, but that's the important move it's making.
Yeah, and that's what syncs up completely. In fact, to connect it back to what Jordan was saying, was in 1996, I'd fallen into evolutionary psychology, and then shifted from evolutionary psychology to say, okay, well, I can track how we evolved to primates, but there's a fundamental Big Bang jump through the primate hominid layer, where we start to sync up intersubjectivity, and then we yoke our through patterns into symbols. And then I saw this in the origin of language. The real connection isn't so much even just the symbol for me, but it's the proposition. The proposition that then makes a factual, that then creates what I call negative space around the factual. And then we have to engage in question answer dialogue to build what I then call justification systems. And these justification systems are a whole nother level of cultural person mentality on top of our animal existence. And that makes us, accelerate into a totally different new space, as it were. I actually think about the tree of knowledge maps the universe in 4 big bangs. There's the first from energy to matter, and then you go from matter to life, and then life to animal mind, and then animal mind into language, person, culture. And maybe we're on the set of the 5th big bang, which is this fucking digital virtual, which is another network of information process and communication system that the universe has not seen.
I mean, yeah, Greg, I mean, it's sort of refreshing to hear you say that. There's a way in which I could reconstitute a bunch of what you said in kind of generative anthropological language, but you seem to kind of have very, very similar insights around how all of this works. One thing I'll say is, there's many ways to describe generative anthropology. Another one is there's kind of a evolution of the modes of grammar. And so, grammar, social grammar, starts off as what we call ostensive, which is kind of a point. It was nonverbal communication. And then it moves to the imperative, which is a command, and then the interrogative, which is a question, and then ultimately the declarative, which is the propositional sentences that we're speaking in today. We live in a very hyper-declarative culture, but language has all these subterranean modes that structure it, give it authority, and that when we pay attention to, open up radical new possibilities.
I mean, the convergence on this is just outrageous. Do you know Michael Tomasello's work at all?
He is maybe the exact point where we'll contribute. Yes.
There you go.
I mean, Jordan.
Yeah, so Michael Tomasello captures the pre-verbal shared attention intention, literally called we space, which I then map as the influence matrix at the level of the human, which creates a self-other space of tracking process in relation. And it is that capacity, theory of mind, participant, use John's language, a perspectival, participatory, intersubjective we space that then is identified through the point, through in Tomasello, through the shared attention and intention, indicative of a point capacity, meaning you point and you look where I'm pointing, and other apes don't do that. And that's a million years ago, 500,000 years ago, laying the groundwork for the shared attention intentional space that then results in symbolic tagging, and then results in declarative statements, and then results in questions, and then results in fucking arguments and propositional networks.
Exactly right.
It's unbelievable. And that's
you're exactly
all right. We're fucking synced, Jordan. Let's go. Somebody fly.
Gentlemen, we're gonna have to do better next time. I think that took 7 minutes. I gotta get those are rookie numbers, right? I need full disciplinary sync between people who haven't met before in under 3 minutes if we're going to make this thing happen.
Right. I thought we were professionals here.
No, it's great. Michael Tomasello's the psychologist GA leans the most upon, for what it's worth. I mean, he's a genius. And although let me say one thing about Michael, not to pick on him too much, but there's a sentence in, I believe, his book, The Natural History of Morality, where he says something like, religion was only used, for some members of the tribe to sort of gain authority over others, kind of like tricking them, sort of cynical read of religion. I think this is the biggest mistake he makes. He's a genius in terms of this notion of shared modes of attention. And then I think that's where generative anthropology kind of comes in and tries to, kind of rehabilitate that a little bit. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah,
I agree completely.
Well, it's interesting. Okay, so there's a move. What I'd like to propose is, if we're just going by the framework that I just articulated, in some sense, we have something like a triangle now. So now the challenge is to say, let's talk about the center. And in the center of the triangle, I would propose, naturally, is the scene of the fifth joint point, which I have I coined the name game B, but it's the same.
It's totally the same thing.
It's the same. I don't know if GA has that notion. GA may have the notion of like, there was a little bang, dude. And by the way, what happened after that, kind of not my deal. But Greg and I come into it Greg and I both, frankly, come into it under the heading of something like the presence, the presence here and now, always, the omnipresence of creation, right? The ongoing creation. God, it sounds very theological, but that's going to be the point in a second, which is to say that it's not like it's kind of weird as I kind of think about it. It's not like for some magical reason, there was exactly one moment of creation 13.6 billion years ago. There was a big bang. And for whatever reason, the nature of reality that gave rise to the possibility of 0 to 1 just fucking shut down all at once forever. And we've all been playing out a game of marbles since then. Like, no, in point of fact, the opposite. It has not stopped in the least, but two things. The reality, the event horizon of the things that were participating in the field of creation has in fact changed over time. Right? So this is the arc of the UTOK, right? You have the movement from quantum and quarks into atoms, into molecules, right? And there's a structure, and the possibility largely focuses in the adjacent possible, on the bleeding edge of what is in fact already part of existence. Right? So the field of the Big Bang, right, the little bang in the GA language, is the same source as the Big Bang, but happening in the novel context that the field of the adjacent possible is now social animals, primates. Right? All right, so all that. So now what we're saying, what I'm proposing, is that the center of the scene is the center of this fifth joint point. The center is, okay, culture is now very much part of this field of existence. Culture exists. There's lots and lots of culture. We create all kinds of culture. And the energy of the Big Bang is showing up in this moment on the adjacent possible of that aspect of existence, of culture, which of course integrates and includes all the rest. Like, I'm not denying that at all. This is what the tree metaphor is very nice. So the inquiry now is something like, there's a lot of interesting things. Right? As you said, there's something about this particular moment that is qualitatively different, not the least of which is we're fucking talking about it. Right? The point of the little bang was the popping out of the space that has been named a wide variety of different things by different people in different places, in which the capacity for the movement of creation in the context of the field of existence can actually be contemplated in some mode of reality that is precisely the distinct from the field of existence. I'm using language from Forrest Landry to make precise distinctions.
Exactly. In fact, you nailed that with me. I mean, I'd felt that before, but our last conversation, I actually stopped, take a breath, and found myself on the precipice as you articulated that in a new angle. So that cause to choice, that Forrest Landry frame of cause to choice and the awakening of conscious evolution and its potentiality at this edge point, in the phase shift of now, okay, conscious evolution. And one thing I would say about, I love generative anthropology's framing here, is that to do that, of course, requires an evolution of awareness, of awareness of our essence, of our, an anthropology, an awareness of what we are in relation to afford us that capacity of waking up and having an understanding of the landscape. So one thing certainly of it is that it affording a particular kind of richness to enable a particular kind of awakening, at least on that side of the equation.
And one of the things that keeps showing up, and so I'll just, again, what I'll do is I'll place it in the center, is this question of religion. And so I actually took the time to write an article. One of the last Medium pieces I wrote actually was on science and religion, in many ways motivated by an awareness that this was going to be part of the conversation. Because we're operating right now, particularly in the West, where there's a lot of loaded bias, a lot of loaded energy about the meaning of this concept, which most of which is just leftover conflict at the level of systems of justification, and the sort of the power dynamics associated with the struggle that occurred in history. Okay, but it has very little to do with the thing we're trying to actually talk about. So part of what's going to happen in the scene of the fifth joint point is kind of like a standing up and dusting off, polishing and reconfiguring the thing oftentimes named religion, which is a thing. It's a part of something. And the way I would talk about it is something like, look, guys, if I imagine a wagon, right, and it's made out of like twigs and sticks gathered in the forest, lashed together with natural plant fibers. Right? So this is a rickety fucking wagon, okay? And then I brought this wagon in front of you and said, vehicle, and you had a Tesla next to it, you'd be like, no, that's a shitty vehicle. And I'm talking about vehicle. I'm not talking about wagon, right? So if you look at religion and you map that to an architecture, a manifestation in various forms of embodiment, dealing with the practicalities of human psychology and institutional development and awareness and maturity that emerged over 10,000 years, you are mistaking a wagon for vehicle. But when we're talking about, look, I got a problem. How do I move energy through space-time with effectiveness? Well, I'm going to need a vehicle. Cool. If I want to get through the fifth joint point, I'm going to need religion.
Totally. And I'll speak to somebody who gets raised as a new atheist and now is essentially religious, right? To be like, yes.
Yes. And I can honor new atheism. It's okay.
Sure.
Yep.
I mean,
one of the things that fucked up religion was it identified imaginary thinking. It just didn't have a disambiguation between the thing that it was supposed to be doing and how it was supposed to do it, and the capacity to glue imaginal thinking. And, Zack, Tomasello's point is not random, right? And the capacity to actually use these structures and institutions to, in fact, engage in differential allocations of political and economic power. Yes, that happened, right? Things accumulate.
Yeah.
Fine. We're dust it
history
off.
did. Yeah. History did happen. And I think you're exactly right. I think one thing that generative anthropology might say about religion is that it's good anthropology, bad cosmology. Another thing that it will point out is the kind of fight between atheists and deists often kind of comes down to the question of, did man create God or did God create man? And you'll notice the kind of symmetrical claims, and it sort of wants to wrap them up and say, in some sense, it happened at the same time in this event. And it's hard to actually say who created what. I mean, we can inquire to that question, but you'll notice the kind of fearful symmetry of those two points. I think generative anthropology has a lot to say too about science and religion, and the ways in which kind of the Enlightenment, in some sense, represents this kind of scapegoating we're still a part of those kind of religious institutions that, again, made a lot of great Enlightenment things possible, and also kind of clouded a lot of our thinking around it, I think.
Yeah, so for anybody who happens to watch this, who comes in particular with the background on theology, the approach that I will generally take is I will generally throw out the baby and the bathwater, with the expectation that because the thing we're dealing with is simply present in the environment, that if we become capable of perceiving clearly, we will effectively recapitulate the most fundamental, the essential aspects in the moment. And that part of our challenge is actually building the competence to do so with clarity and precision now. Right? So there's something to be gained by being aware of and referencing what I might call like the tone or the harmonic frequency or the echo of all of the lineages that have rediscovered the thing we're talking about. And there's something to be lost in being lost in the artifacts of that process. Right? So our job is to be artists, which is to say our job is principally to learn how to tune into the scene. Our job is to become capable of expressing through ourselves the creative principle that is the thing that we are speaking about and speaking on behalf of. And if we can do that with enough competence and strength, our artistry shall manifest something that those who are coming with different architectures will be like, yeah.
Totally. To me, one of the things that was coming to mind is sort of like, hey, religion is like this collective desire to get the right relation to is and ought. I mean, that's what it's trying to do. At this most abstract, it's creating a religio that affords a particular, and if that is, we can then toss out baby and bathwater and let that return in a particular way. That resonates.
Yeah,
sure. It's worth noting too. I mean, we know of no kind of human social orders in existence that are not in their origin religious, right? I mean, every human society has a religious component, right? So something is going on with the nature of human and religion. Even the word religion, I believe, means relinking, right? And so there's all these kind of dimensions to unravel there. But I think this is kind of one of the really important open questions that hopefully generative anthropology can shine a light on.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start running. So one of the things that just popped in my head was I felt very strongly called, I guess about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I can't remember now, to write an essay on my Substack. It may have actually been the very first one that was almost like agreement zero for the thing that I'm calling civium. Right? So my proposition of what the arc looks like that takes us through the join point. And agreement zero had to do specifically with the notion of the sacred. Right? So the intuition I had was that the very specific pivot point was you can't be part of, you're not yet capable of participating in this scene if you don't have a felt sense in yourself of what the meaning of the notion of sacred is. So if you don't have sacred profane as a distinction and can't begin to use that in some way, I'm not talking about you don't have a architecture of dead objects that you can point to that somebody else told you are sacred. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that slot, that niche in your sense making, in your soul, is that a valid place? Is there a way for you to get there? Or are you still basically in the 19th century endeavoring to kind of cleanse the notion of the sacred and ended up at the end of the New Atheist period with nothing left, and nothing left but an animosity towards the concept? If that's where you are, you're kind of still behind the times, right? That's you're super 1950s, and we're way past the 50s. Like that's not where we are. So maybe that's the point. The proposition there is that seems like a very foundational moment.
Love it. And I would say in terms of sort of when I'm thinking about sort of like religion and, well, what is it in a sort of a traditional sense? I'm going to go in my primate transcendent self. Okay. And what I mean by that, this is stuff John and I talk about, where the egoic propositional drops out and you shift the grip on the self-world relation, quasi through right hemisphere, but it's a fundamental perspectival participatory self-world gripping. that then affords a different kind of ontonormativity that says, oh my gosh, that I am connected to something larger than myself that then matters in the world. And then that's is an orienting, compass for the sacred through that. And then there's the egoic justifier, which is then trying to bring propositions to organize the sense making in relation to that. That's trying to say, well, if this is, and there is ought, and this is why there is an ought. And I think what the atheistic thing, or what got confused maybe in many of the original religions, is what do we mean by metaphor and what do we mean by concreteness? And then science comes along and slays the literal concrete versions of the Santa Claus versions and says victory, and then completely undermines the collective gaggle ideas of the mythos that then afford the way humans can get together and narrate the sacred in particular kinds of ways, and afford that balance between the intuitive, transcendent, and a propositional structure. And quite frankly, with the emergence of science, that does give us new ontological things to wrestle with, that then need to be re-updated into our propositional narrative of isness. And that's what I see the sort of the challenge as, at least at the analytic logos level.
Just to kind of metabolize and refine back, the place where you began, so the proposal that there's in fact, let's call it just two modes. And so you're talking about the fact that you and John, you talk about at the minimum two modes, one of which you identify with something like the egoic systems of justification. And the other, I'm not sure that you gave it a particular name, but the whole point of the other is that there's an otherness to it. That's more or less exactly what I'm pointing at. And so when I say, like, do you have room for the distinction, for the notion that the sacred, the concept of the sacred has content? What I'm saying is, are you in this conversation from the point of view of the egoic mode, in which case the answer is going to be no, or this other mode, in which case the answer is going to be yes, and in a very and I don't know exactly necessarily what that means, but the simple answer is yes. I feel that there is something being called by this. Now, generative anthropology puts real content there, really beautiful anthropological content.
Yeah, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's a sense in which when I'm hearing that, it's almost this question of, are you coming in good faith, right? In a couple dimensions there, right? And so the theological kind of always is under the surface in a way that we try to sort of banish it. I mean, there's a real sense, I think, in which too our world today has a kind of there's been a real desacralization, and yet it kind of pops up in all these certain ways. Jordan and I were joking the other day about sort of, if you capitalize certain letters and words, it does a strange thing to the text, right? It adds sacrality where people they want to banish sacrality. But there's a sense in which, yeah, it's always right there. And so I think, just being aware of that and open to that is a much healthier relation than the kind of naively trying to sort of think you could totally banish the sacred. I mean, we could talk about the origin. There's a lot generative anthropology even has to say about the origins of science itself and where science appears on the originary scene. And notably, it is effectively desacralization. I mean, I don't want to summarize it too quickly, but like this distinction between sacred and the non-sacred is almost where science itself emerges. Yeah.
Well, let's put out in the shared field the artifacts. The way I tell the story of the little bang, because I think that really helps ground, and it creates a very specific grounding, makes it easier for people who don't necessarily. This is super not obvious, so let's just make it a little bit more explicit. So the story, as I understand it, is something like you've got these hominids, these primates, who are zipping about, and something shows up. This is exactly the way I told it in our conversation. Let's say it's food, because it's a pretty likely food, maybe mating, but let's go with food for now. And the gaggle, right, which is a natural piece of humanness, right? The social primates are all about being able to gaggle, right? Because obviously being able to orient your attention 50% on your first person experience and call it 50% on everybody else's attention orientation is a force multiplier and the ability to explore complex environments fluidly and with subtlety and nuance, right? That's the whole distributed cognition thing, like the scene capacity. All right. Now, one of us encounters food. That one begins to shift into a get food mode, right? Food means eat. Everybody else's attention orients towards that shift in disposition, orients towards the food. Now there's everybody heading towards the food. Right? Now, every time this story is told up until this moment, the little bang, shit gets a little out of control. Right? Because now the only way to resolve the sort of the magnitude of desire for the food over the amount of food available to satisfy that desire is something like ordinary primate dominance hierarchy structures. Right? So there's going to be a lot of screaming and fighting and biting, all kinds of crap, some of which might be quite intense depending on the context. Right? There maybe we may all be really hungry, right? Because desertification has been going on, and there's like a serious, like, if those two don't eat, may not make it, right? So stakes are high. The point being that in the GA story, which I feel very good about, like as a strong hypothesis to operate under, is that something happens where a sort of a popping occurs, a movement occurs in the interior of one of these primates that has like a shifting from being choices strictly being dominated by the logic of the evolutionary lineage that brought us to that moment, right? Just a reactive replaying of the same game, the same dynamic. And in this case, choice emerges as a possibility, right? An actual choice is made. And that choice is at the very beginning, like this, almost I would imagine like this, which by the way, interestingly enough, I mean, for those of you who've taken psychedelics, probably is pretty fucking similar. Right? That whoa, like a pop of wow, shit, some whole new aspect of reality just became present in my experiential field. And part of that aspect of reality is what the fuck's going on? Like almost like something's happening. Like maybe not even pointing at the food, but like, whoa, fuck, guys, we're here. So like that, like you could imagine. And that begins the process, right? But the key there is that moment from my point of view is the moment of what we call the sacred, right? Because this is the presencing in the GA language. And again, I'm sort of operating from that place, is the presencing of peace by virtue of choice. The capacity to begin the process of using our agency to create the possibility of peace, to create a possibility of a new way of behaving with each other in the world than the law, read in tooth and claw, right? That's the essence, like the bottom of sacred is that, right? Which some might call the presence of the kingdom of heaven on earth, right? This whoa, peace. We can have this thing, peace, and then it becomes a problem. And there's a conflict. There's a dynamic. How good are we at waging peace? Not very good. What does that mean? Well, the guy who stopped didn't get the fucking food and he died. But the others got the picture and it began to percolate through, right? So now we're a long time after that. We constantly go through these cycles where in the space of peace, by the way, so no, sorry, I'm now grabbing the content, running a little bit too far. But in the space of peace, one of the things that happens is our capacity and competence for collaboration goes way, way up. But in a field that is dominated still by basic primate characteristics and the cultural logic of win-lose games, we end up subordinating our capacity for innovation to ultimately generate forms of selective competitive advantage. Right? So we have still yoked peace to war. At the end of the day, in us, peace all too often, almost always, is still subservient to war. And we can talk about all kinds of historical, economic reasons why that would be the case. And we can talk about one of the reasons why the fifth joint point is happening is that is no longer valid. Right? I've said this in the past. It's like we're now at a moment where the story that has been told many, many times isn't like a nice to have. It's a must have. Right? If we do not learn how to make peace the ground, and conflict is now happening in the context of peace, if we continue to operate with peace as a subordinate to war, the game's over. This particular story terminates. So we're in this really interesting spot where the essence, the energy of that Big Bang would be this actual, the way I'm visually seeing it is like a sphere that inverts on itself.
Yes, the figure background relation. Rotates
yes,
180.
the figure background relation is the thing that emerges on the originary scene for the first time. Is a foreground and a background, the object and the periphery. And that center periphery relation is very fundamental in GA because it is, in some sense, the relation of the social order writ large at all times. I mean, Jordan's already speaking in terms of the center and the scene in this Zoom call and in the world. This is a fractal kind of relationship. And what you pointed to, Jordan, as well, with the kind of, the firstness, right? That hominid that sort of hesitated and sort of experienced that something like awe. Who knows? We don't want to sort of put categories of cognition that we have today on those. We have to be sort of very careful how we draw that out. But right, hesitated. I mean, that is the origin of free will, right? And we can talk about exactly what that means. And it's both radically free and constrained by the scene, obviously. And so it's this kind of strange combination, but agency develops, religion. I mean, that notion of peace, which you're drawing out all those theological implications for, that is what happens on the scene as well. And so in generative anthropology, we always kind of want to return to the scene and try to draw out things from there, and sort of narrate that evolution. Yeah.
Right. And that originary scene, the way I read it quickly, is essentially people are gathering around like a mammoth, a major sort of task that requires systematic coordination.
Object,
and and then all of a sudden there's a gesture process that then affords the capacity for this collective, to become, wait a minute, there's a collective shared, almost superorganism kind of framing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, exactly. And it's kind of the originary feast, right? You share food together. And think about on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, what do? We gather around, we all wait patiently, and then we slowly divide up the food safely. And if you don't, it's strange.
Right, you cut into the turkey before, people are like, what the fuck?
Right, what are you doing? You've done something profane. I mean, you're still on the scene in many ways. And even Christmas, right? You tear apart these gifts in this kind of strange sacral relation of the center and the periphery. So we're never escaping these kind of dynamics. But to Jordan's point, we can have more sophisticated ways of thinking through them, and we can become aware of them, right? And this is the kind of historicity, is the modes of language are different than they were on the evolutionary scene, right? We're talking about it, we're aware of it. And so this is the creative dimension, the ongoing creation that is possible. And this is why, by the way, Girard is in some sense, all Girard can give you at some level is the scapegoating mechanism. And it paradoxically kind of turns you into a scapegoat, because all you can do is kind of point out the mechanism when you see it. Generative anthropology is this kind of creative dimension, which is what humans are capable of. And yeah.
And one of the things that the influence, so there's a thing called the influence matrix. It's the fourth idea on the tree back there, the yellow circle. Okay. And what it's on it is sort of the guiding system of your social primate heart. Just the social primate heart is the way you track the relational influence matrix of self-other relations in the field. Okay. And it argues that we had in hominid, in mammal in the past, you have pretty separate dominance claims in particular roles. So I'm going to battle you and then see where you are. Then I have mate roles and sex and things like that. You might have, if you're a parent, usually female parent, then you have a particular kind of caretaking role. And they are relatively fragmented, meaning you basically, in evolutionary psych terms, you have domain modular specificity, which means that, okay, in this context, I bring this particular role, but they aren't unified in the same overarching field. And the argument is that as we get hunter-gatherer activity, as we really create this collective 2 million years ago to 500,000 years ago, that the capacity for cooperative shared attention intention then brings the process participatory procedural aspects all together, to use John Vervaeke's language. And the matrix then says, actually, what you then get is the self-other matrix field, intrapsychically, interpersonally. And then the process dimensions of power and love and freedom are not separated. So this is guy I got to kill, and this girl I got to fuck, but it's like, oh no, actually we're in love, power, freedom relations all together, because we can then engage in all sorts of different flexible roles. And I can then track where I am in the space. And then the argument would be that grows into a collective intersubjective space. And it's tracking the capacity to track that space and be a part of it in coordination would give rise to things like music. Okay, so the ability to then plug into a particular field and have the system behave as a group and be able to position, model the self in relationship to the relational world in a much more integrated way. That's one of the arguments that happens to us that makes us quite different, lines up right with Tomasello.
Nice. So check this out. So let's say you've got I'm putting together some Lego blocks. So you've got I don't even call it the creative principle or the field of the anti-rivalrous. Like there's many different ways to name it, but it has to do with precisely that which is the source of of innovation, of the creation of novelty in world. Okay. And then you've got something like essentially effectively like an antenna, like a configuration of existence, a configuration of the aspects of reality that are greater or lesser degrees of affordance to that particular field of the anti-rivalrous. And this can be very simple. Like as an individual person, if you are like driving in traffic, it's very difficult to compose a poem, right? It's very easy to recognize in yourself that there are certain circumstances, certain contexts whereby your ability to be creative is more supported, and there are circumstances where your ability to be creative is less supported. Okay?
Some of us can never write poems, though.
Well, maybe it has to do with stuff going on in the interior, or by the way, like addictions to nicotine. Like there's a whole lot of the context is complex,
No.
or whatever. Coffee, yeah, coffee has a whole thing, right? All right, so now we have is a sort of a semi-stochastic, this is the whole kind of Brownian motion, evolutionary, biological, from the bottoms up dynamic, whereby every once in a while, in my mind, it's literally like this, like a zap thing, where like some configuration of of reality hits a particular like higher resonance with the field of the anti-rivalrous, which then has this like building up, like a rapid advance, like a movement, because that's where novelty can land. Right? More innovation can happen on that location. But because the stochastic energy of the larger system, things don't stick there; they kind of pop off. And so that's a thing. Right? The point is that that's a thing. Like that's a deep, fundamental aspect of the nature of the universe in which we live.
Totally.
And the joint points, the UTOK, is almost like watching a calcification of one of those sub-oceanic piles.
Yep.
It's like a crystal. It's a crystal growing, right? And where the resonant frequency, but it's a crystal growing in this case around the essence of the creative principle in general, right? Discovering what configurations of space-time and relational characteristics, architectures, geometries happen to increase the intensity, like the degree of fidelity with the creative principle, and the durability, the degree to which you can actually stay on that spot. Right. So now we've got kind of like the metaphor in my mind is like a solar sail.
Yep.
Powered by a laser. You feel
totally.
You ever seen that image?
Yeah.
Now the laser's got a very large amount of relative photonic energy, but it's a tiny spot. Right. So if I have a solar sail, I got to be right on it. If I'm right on it, I can fly. Like I can go out of the sun's gravitational well. So we're now trying to basically consciously use all this power that's available in modeling, right, and being able to sort of like use principles and concepts and constructs and various things that are available in this new thing and this thing in a big way, because obviously the number gets a lot bigger when you do it that way, to explore how do we just surf that wave better, man? Like there's this thing, the field of creation. If we can get on the field of creation and just stay there, like stick it, and just always maintain our position on that thing, that's always going to be the best place to be. Like it's not, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't care. It's always the best place to be.
And I stumbled into the icon of the elephant sun god as the lodestar for that. It's the god of light that basically is like, hey, this negentropic, coherent, integrative thing, right? That would then orient your light sail and orient the beam of energy information we're trying to ride.
Right. So let's ground it, like, again, very concrete. You can imagine like many times this conversation's been had, right? You've got this guy, right? He's an early hunter gatherer. Shit, people are getting really chippy. He's like, hey, check it, man. Like, I know this is going to sound crazy, but you know how like if we're all hunting together, it works better than if we're hunting as individuals. What would happen if we did that more? Like, what if we applied that same notion to like other things? Like we maybe tried to team up more and more of life. And some people are like, oh, it's a pretty good idea. And that group fucking dials it in, right? A group that's able to collaborate on a larger surface area of what's available. Like, how about we like work together on how we raise our kids?
Right.
Oh shit. Wait, so it's just not like a single female raising kids, but it's a female and her mom are collaborating on child rearing?
this will work as long as people have the sacred and the felt sense of it, by the way, because that's the sociopath problem, right?
Right.
Now,
Well, okay. Okay. So now,
right.
so now the point is basically we can pop a little bit into something like the engineering. Right? There's a
Yeah.
design. There's a sociopath problem.
Mhm.
There's a sociopath problem. That's
Yeah.
there, right? Tyson Yunkaporta, he's like, look, dude, we've been doing this for 50,000 years. There's a sociopath problem. Like, that's kind of it. As soon as somebody
About
goes
1%, 1 to 2% from the psychologist vantage point, you know. It's,
well, unfortunately,
you know,
we've been selecting for a higher ratio.
Yeah,
Our-
especially up in leadership. Jesus.
Exactly. Genghis Khan gave us a lot of sociopaths, right?
Right.
If mating is gated on the ability to kill other men and have very large harems of not particularly glad female partners, then you're in fact generating and unfortunately large concentrations of this particular neurotypological basis in your population. So we've got a sociopath problem, and our sociopath problem happens to be like the scabies. Like we actually got a bit of a real cleansing that has to happen. Fair enough, right? There you go. One design, deal with the sociopath problem, noticing that it actually gets easier over time because you are shifting both the objective context. We live literally in an institutional structure that was designed by and for sociopaths. Not a good place to be. So let's not do that. Let's design away from that. And let's start doing like just even basic like epigenetics. Can we start working at the epigenetic level to down-regulate as if sociopaths, right? The number of, I think strictly, and by the way, the Weinstein brothers and I spent a lot of time on this like 10 years ago. It's a big problem for them, which makes sense, right? If you're familiar with these kinds of ideas from an evolutionary perspective. The number of like strictly obligate genetic sociopaths is probably not that large.
Yeah.
Right? Got both a lot of developmental, right? People who just suffer enormous abuse in early childhood development, both at the physical and the nutritional and psychological level. And then you've got secondary developmental, which we call the as if, right? So, I'm a CEO of a major corporation. I'm a general in the military, right? I have to like turn off all of the human stuff to be able to participate in the system at an effective level. Otherwise, I'm simply selected out. Right. So we've got our like the primary tone, I hate to say it, of our educational system, which is the context in which we develop people, is be a sociopath.
Right. Actually, in the technical clinical psych language I use, that's the antisocial behavioral propensities to be antisocial. And you get antisocial personality disorders whereby people have been fucked by life. And so they fuck it. It's a dog eat dog world out there. Instrumentally, this is the way I'm going to be. But they would have had a heart in relation, and they can still feel it. They
still feel it.
This is anyway.
So in terms of this fifth joint point, right, this is a primary issue. Right? We've got something like it's like, okay, so this is a metaphor I've used yesterday and it seemed to land pretty well. I'm not sure if it'll work here, but if you look at there's a domain called Cellular Automata, which is a little bit like a simple simulation of evolutionary dynamics.
Yep.
So let's say I've got these like little tiny ants that have some basic strategies on, do I take a step forward, sideways, go forward, things like that. And the basic rule is they need to discover a certain amount of food, otherwise they die, right? And then I take them, I put them on this simulated XY field. All right, so the ant is not a real ant, everybody. It's like a piece of computer program, but it puts a dot, and then I just run. And so what happens is I have like the organisms that are searching a field that has differential relationships to a fundamental resource and have the ability to modify their search strategy stochastically. So strict stochastic evolution. And of course, most of them die. Some of them have food. Some of them have strategies that enable them to have more food, but you run it iteratively. And the ones that have strategies that are more or less successful, and by the way, oftentimes just landed next to food. Yeah, right. Run this long enough. What you get is a structure that has two characteristics. One is the organisms are concentrated on the locations that have the most food, right? And the organism's strategies are defined by where they have, in fact, the path-dependent process that got them into those locations. Right? So I've got I'm here. There's a certain like inertial or gravitational attraction. And I have a strategy that gives me the availability to move in different ways, which in this case, broadly speaking, keeps pointing me back, right? Because that's where the food is, yeah? Now, it's a computer program, so snap your fingers or press a button, reset randomly the distribution of food in the field, but keep the organisms where they are. Right? What you're going to see is, from one point of view, the entire game has changed, right? The landscape has changed radically, but from another point of view, nothing has changed. Right? If you're looking at it from the point of view of where are the organisms, they're still all concentrated on where the food used to be. They ain't there anymore, but that's where they are, because that's where their momentum was. That's where they just were located. And their strategies are still the strategies from the old game. They're still like searching for where the food is using old strategies. Okay. But there's a new game. So what will happen is there will be a slow process, an evolutionary process, which is actually in evolutionary theory is called valley crossing. They have to actually go down. They have to unlearn what were effective strategies, come into a place where they're operating with, in some cases, actually, there's a liminal point of almost like random.
Yep.
And then they begin the process of relearning new strategies in the new environment, which will also begin the process of migrating them away from old concentrations. Right now, my hope is this snapping of the fingers happened 10,000 years ago. We're at the Little Bang, and we're still playing out the cultural dynamics of what it takes for that migration from the old game to the new game. Right, that would be my hope. My backup hope is we can iterate through that very rapidly in the moment that we're at. Right? We can take the last bit of like, okay, so for example, you can't participate in this conversation unless you are consciously capable of good faith, which is to say, to be able to come in peace for real. Right? Those are two things. Like I intend to come in peace, and I actually can. Right?
In good faith. In good faith.
Not the same. I have good faith in the sense of I really, really want to be a good player, and there's good faith in the sense of, and I cannot grab the one ring even when Frodo's right next to me. Right? There's not the same. Right? I'm pretty sure Boromir did not sign up for the Fellowship thinking I'm going to fucking steal that ring, although a little tiny bit of him probably did. Right? And that's the point. But he couldn't. Right? Even if he was acting in good faith at some very particular level, his ability to actually act in good faith was not strong enough. Right? So there's a collaborative process of saying, okay, and by the way, recognizing we're all learning. Right? We're still at the end of the day, none of us, I don't think, are strong enough to truly show up in good faith all the way down. Right? So we got to be very careful and support each other. This is a Sangha, not a Buddha moment, as far as I can tell. And there's a sociopath, so let's find a way to prevent that from getting into the interior of the interior for at least until we can figure out how to convert that from a sociopath back into a person.
Yep.
And I am, 85% human, but here's places where I actually end up making bad choices. How do we notice collectively when I'm off the path and support me in getting back on and minimize the harm that results? And that's at least a piece, right? That is a piece.
I think that's beautiful, and I think that one thing that sort of you can all kind of agree on in a sense is this ability for humans to participate in language, right? That fundamental kind of egalitarian principle, though it doesn't actually mean egalitarian in the kind of like totalizing sense of the word, but nonetheless, the ability for us to understand one another, even the sociopath or point to anyone, if they can engage in that, that's all you need. That's the start. That's the whole thing. And it doesn't mean it's easy or simple or anything, but we have that capacity by being human, and that's a gift. And let's see what can be done with that.
Nice. So what I heard you say, the way my mind sort of explored the space of what I heard was there really is just straight up a distinction between talking with a person and talking with an AI chatbot.
And AI people don't realize this, by the way. I mean, there's a lot we could say about AI, but I mean, fundamentally, there's a very important difference.
Yeah.
This way you can learn things from that in the same way I could write poems to myself and learn things from that experience. But there's a transcendent dimension to speaking with another human being that is in principle accessible. And that is not possible with an AI chatbot, at least the AI chatbots we have today.
Right.
And I'm skeptical that yeah.
And then the inversion of that is something like if you're showing up as an AI chatbot in conversation, that's a problem. Like find a way to stop doing that.
Right.
Right. We're not sure you're in touch with the sacred.
You're not. Yeah. And this is when you kind of want to shake somebody or something like that. And this goes back to, that is actually language, by the way. Shaking somebody, saying, hey man, what's going on? That is the kind of nonverbal, sacral, physical dimensions that human beings have access to. A chatbot does not have access to. You can shake a person, and sometimes that works, So
right. Well, so let's explore this. Let's explore this set of concepts and what they imply for sort of where we are. So we use this, I think, Zach, in our previous conversation. So what this metaphor represents is something like, logos. I used logos to define it. And the idea here is that the meaning of the word is not contained in the utterance of the word. Right? The meaning of the word is contained in its connection. And we can say like to the sacred, to the transcendent, to the creative principle, to something that's beyond ourselves, to the seen, to consciousness. Like I don't need to, the whole point is like I can invoke the Taoist point and say that up there is precisely the thing that isn't named. It's the thing that gives meaning to the things that are named. And there's something about connectedness, which Forrest again called continuity. Right? I'm actually connected in general, like mode 2, right? Not egoic mode, but mode 2. All right. So if I'm connected, I'm now engaged in logos. Okay. And there's something about that logos that is all about like where we are, like how you do this thing, how you do communication. If you and I are both engaged in logos, there's a process where we have to sort of like find the point where we're, there it is. And then we're there. And now we're in a shared scene. And then there's this, right? And the way I term that is this is logo. And I'm not referring to like Nike's logo. Right? There's something about the discontinuity, the disconnectedness. But mode 1 doesn't have can't distinguish. Right? Again, an AI chatbot operates exclusively in logo. Right? And there's things that can be done in terms of Markov babbling and whatever. Like there's just statistical inference. But specifically, there's 2 elements to this. One element is, hold on, let me shift back a little bit. God, there's actually a bajillion elements. Let me see if I can get this just right so it's clear. This move happens for a couple of different reasons. One reason is very natural, and that is the scene has changed. Right? The context in which we're operating has gotten more intense, more complex than our collective capacity to hold the integrity of continuity. So, but particularly remember, the sphere of peace increases our innovative capacity, which means it changes our context. By virtue of changing our context, it actually begins to it overwhelms our capacity to navigate that context in the base state of peace. And so somebody comes with a sword and the potential possibilities of sword are so much stronger than the potential possibilities of fist that we have this we have a break. It's just, we can't quite hold peace with this we haven't integrated that into our capacity. Our culture has not yet integrated this new competence. Think about the introduction of the nuclear bomb, right? The nuclear bomb brought a deep conscious awareness of the fact that up until that point, the standards of culture of humanity couldn't manage that level of destructive power. Right? For 2 or 3 decades, humanity was scared out of its mind that we were just going to kill everything because we're like, dude, we don't know how to deal with that. Like we just fucking fought World War II. We had concentration camps. Like we are not prepared to deal with this level of power. We're fucked. Somehow we managed to and integrate it through, right? And that was like the beautiful genius of that mid-century period, which by the way, so that's all right. So that creates a new, like an integrative process of a new expansion of competence in the field of peace in the context of the complexity of the environment. Logos comes back in. Now we're living in a connected culture. Our culture is alive, right? There is a scene that human beings are operating in. The gaggle is there, and we're searching the environment. And again, right? And we create new stuff, and we may accidentally pop this up, right? We need to become conscious of that and not do that, right? That's the thing. We get really, really good at holding this first and make sure we don't accidentally, recklessly accelerate past our capacity to do that. Like that's job 1, right? 2 other ways that it happens. One is at a micro level, at a micro level, I not being aware of what's happening, say something that happens to hit Greg in a location of his capacity to come in good faith that is unconsciously a trigger. He becomes triggered, we pop out of the field, but we're still in the same room. Right? So if we don't notice that we've just popped out of the field, then we're actually engaging in a bad faith relationship, but not aware of it. And that can obviously create all kinds of stuff.
Every once in a while, that happens with couples.
On occasion, I've heard rumors.
I've seen that as a marriage therapist, believe it or not. I know that's going to surprise everybody.
And of course, as you say, when that happens, you get this very confusing thing, right? This is the Moloch event occurring in that dynamic. We can both agree that this is not a place where we want to be, and yet our behaviors are making it worse. Why? In point of fact, we're doing this, meaning we're now using language as systems of justification and dominance hierarchies to establish control over the event and execute on a variety of different, very basic, primate things, and each one of which decreases the capacity to actually reconnect, right? So there's like the things that are happening at the microstructure and the things that are happening at the macrostructure to maintain the integrity of the field of logos. Yeah,
Totally.
Okay, the third, the sociopath problem. The third is there's something about a whole strategy that is about optimizing in this location. Okay, so there's a, and let's just bring us to this moment. So in many ways, the threat of nuclear holocaust gave rise to a forced evolution in consciousness on the part of the world, and particularly in the part of the West. Okay. We gotta learn how to wage peace like a lot better than we used to. Let's create the UN. Let's create like the Peace Corps. Let's do whatever we got to do, right, to make this not happen. And by the way, not necessarily all good. Let's create the Rand Corporation, the CIA too. Like, let's just we're not necessarily bad, but the point is not, we call it sunshines and rainbows. Like, we got to solve this problem. Okay, so something happened and this huge expansion occurred. One of the things that happens is, hold on, let me see if I can figure out how to say this right. It's like that culture, particularly to mode 1, if I'm in the mode of dominance hierarchy, I begin to basically eat and consume in this space.
Okay.
I begin to lose track of this because I'm not really participating in this anymore. Like what average school kid, think about just being in school. The whole process of being in school is to literally do that. Educational system is that. That is all it is. It's like, hey, don't create shit. Learn how to run the machinery these fucking guys developed well. Right? So there's an optimization algorithm that is implicit in any institutional form. All institutional forms implicitly are optimizing away from the wholeness of human and towards some particular competence in an increasingly rococo cultural structure.
Yep.
Right? And what happens, of course, is that my local incentive structures are, and this is I'm reiterating the notion that we've developed a machine that is designed to say, be a sociopath. Our local incentive structures, our local context become a better and better cog in this machine, and the machine becomes taken as reality. Baudrillard, if you aren't familiar with Baudrillard, this is the descent into the simulation. Right? So this happening in small moments constantly through your life, every transaction with money, right? Every interaction with the DMV does that, right? It just severs that and more reinforces how to build optimization strategies in your own egoic structure, which begins to create this, this forgetting, like you forget mode 2. Yep. You just start looking for, how do I win, right? How do I navigate this hazardous environment? And culture begins to look like a niche in and of itself, as opposed to a methodology for producing abundance in the context of nature. Yeah. Yep. Now, when culture is a niche in and of itself, we're right back in Girard land. Right? The point is, culture is the thing that allowed us to move out of Girard land in the context of nature. But when culture becomes a niche in and of itself, there is no thing above culture that allows us to once again escape from Girard land. Right? So that's the challenge, right? But the point is, we can do that, right? We can restore that and get back into that location. And all right, so there's a whole lot there, but this distinction between logos and logo, right? To notice, am I speaking from a place of connectivity, or am I merely manipulating signs in what is effectively a sociopathic grift? Right? And is that happening? You see this. I mean, the evolution of social media has been an enormous training ground for humans to participate in there is nothing but iterations in sociopathic grift.
So I come to this again through the, that's a good time. I come to this, or an angle I bring to this again through the influence matrix. Okay, so the influence matrix then maps our, so here's a couple of thoughts. One mode is called the affiliative mode. Okay. Affiliation, the way we actually affiliation works is affords us the extension of self into other. And in fact, actually, you can argue the brain mechanisms do exactly that. That is, they represent your interests, they represent other interests, and in an affiliative mode, they bring them together and then create static. So like your pain is my pain. So that it really expands. And when you're in the hostile mode, it's the exact opposite. Massive separation of the other's interests, my interests, and I actually start feeling pleasure sometimes at their pain. Okay, right. So you can see this called the red line, and it's this whole dimension of where self-other interests are and how to mix they're fused, okay, versus not. So that, and then the blue line is the fundamental is, and we project our hierarchy of space onto these lines, by the way. So the way we map, well, what's above this versus and the potential energy of that, well, that's a dominant and they're above, okay. And then winning and losing in relationship to that dominance hierarchy. And then understanding the very close and very complicated relationship between power and love around these issues is really central because yes, there's the sociopath, but in everyday world, there's this very, very complicated mix of power and love. That's what, like I made a joke about couples, it's like, it's a complicated network of that world. And the last thing I'll say in relationship with the influence matrix honed me in on is the difference between oriented towards social influence, which is the instrumental capacity to move shit around. Okay. I can move you as a function of social influence, that as essentially synonymous with power, although use power slightly different. It's just the capacity. Can I get you to move in accordance with my interests at an instrumental level? Okay. Versus, and you've heard me say this before, Jordan, but I'll say it for Zach here, versus the felt sense of relational value. That is being known and valued by important others for your essence. Okay. So to connect the fundamental difference is like, hey, you take care of your kid because you fucking love your kid, not because I'll pay you $20. In fact, to be paid to be a good father would be totally weird, precisely because your whole orientation is, I want to find the value structure, the core sacred value of the other individual and be oriented in that way. However, the capital labor and many of the industrial structures are essentially totally grounded on outcome and influence. In other words, what's the quantitative structures that you can acquire and relation, and the combination then of science and it's undermining some of our traditional sacred notions, basically then elevates the accumulation of fucking toys as the sacred. And it's the fun, and that drives a particular structure of mode of being that fundamentally eats away at the soul, because it's a felt sense of relational value, not the fucking instrumental control over shit that we want to be. Absolutely. We want to elevate and gain B.
Absolutely. And I think these institutions and their disciplines, and if you think about the word discipline, we use that kind of the academic sense. It's kind of the sense I'm evoking it, but it's worth thinking about kind of the other connotations that word has. In a sense, they can't explain their own origins. Economics can't explain kind of the market or sociology, society, or and it's through that kind of their lack of inquiry into themselves, which is not sort of random. It is important, and that's worth inquiring into. That sort of results in the lack of these sacred human, characteristics that you're sort of pointing out here. And when we forget that, and when those disciplines and institutions structure ourselves away from ourselves, I mean, it's just totally, it's very inhuman. And I think that's kind of the feeling a lot of people are feeling in the world, in this kind of post-World War world, controlled by these disciplines and institutions so powerfully.
Totally. The institutions are operating on both antiquated and now off-kiltered systems that are not oriented towards cultivating. We have to fundamentally shift where that food is for at the institutional level, and if we can figure out how to upgrade that quickly, that would be glorious.
So there's a nice little piece. That's a good segue. So what I said earlier, my hope of like that we had this shift had happened a long time ago. My current frame is something like it did, and it's kind of constantly gone through a series of iterations, like a pulsing process. So now we're entering into a new pulsing process.
Exactly.
At a fundamental level, this is sort of a metaphor, but the need is for people to be oriented on the basis of, let's say, their heart, or on the basis of this deeper sense of human value, and to be orienting their choices on that basis. All right, that's the need. That's can be very, very challenging, because that's a valley crossing exercise. Right? If you're doing that, you're actually moving away from the old food. Right? You're moving away from the entire institutional momentum of the culture that is dead. But the point is, it's a dead culture. Right? So what happens when a culture becomes dead is it becomes beset by parasites. It's a corpse. Intrinsically, parasites are going to become the things that eat it. It's no longer alive. All right. If you're in that, it can be very, like, you'll feel a deep pull in your own integrity. Your deeper, most fundamental self, like the one that is oriented towards the notion of the sacred, is yearning to find some way to pull towards a more human, more humane way, right? To become more human. Your egoic self is like, fuck that. Look, if I do that,
there's food to get.
I lose my job, I lose my friends, I'm homeless, like, right? Which is all real, right? I'm not saying it's not real, right? So on the one hand, there's like one piece of this is some fraction of the population who, for whatever reason, either like just because they can't help it, they're artists and saints and they're just cannot help, or circumstances have made it fortuitous that they have the capacity to move over here and can make that choice, right? Whatever it happens to be. They begin the process of moving into this new space and creating the new space of liminality, right? The new space of the new scene, right? They're sitting in the new scene going, I don't know what this new scene is, man, but it's definitely more in the direction of rightness. Like, I'm feeling lots of rightness, but not a lot of ability to say it, right? So we're, it's like this, like the logos is like, all right, it's time to get new words, which is a lot of what's going on, if you notice, right?
And what was that guy in the originary scene doing except feeling a sense of rightness that he could barely articulate? I mean, that's exactly what.
Yeah, literally could barely articulate because words hadn't been invented yet. Right. I've got to invent language, like the whole thing. All we got to do is actually.
Do I raise my hand here?
Now, here's like the last 5 minutes, because remember this weird origin story of this conversation began with me putting on an essay of NFTs.
Right.
And I've been like hammering on this. I'll probably actually create a whole nother series on just that. But that does represent a reset, right? The reality is the economic, financial artifacts that were bound up in the mid-century cultural milieu are in the process of rapidly evaporating from the old game into some new game. Now, it's not game B per se, but it's oriented more in that direction. It's part of what I've been calling the transition for a long time. Like, so there's a transitionary move, which has lots of characteristics of what we're looking for. For example, healthy, effective participation in the emergent NFT DAO space involved, for example, a vastly higher orientation towards aesthetics and vibe, learning how to vibe with, because it's moving at a faster pace and it's more fluid. Right. So the ability of the ego, particularly a 20th century ego, to navigate that structure and play like bureaucratic power dominance games is vastly less capable.
Wow.
This new space has a space where if you're kind of showing up as a dick, people just kind of flow past you. You're not showing up in good faith. There's too much going on. I can't deal with that. Like, that's just too much. And by the way, you can't even coordinate using ordinary linguistics. Like, there's so much happening so rapidly, so complex that it has to start happening in that space of the gaggle. So there's a natural rediscovery of the ordinary human mode that is necessary to thrive. You have to find a way to tune into the architecture that allows you to be in that field of the anti-rivalries. And when it happens, what happens? Whoosh, stuff occurs. Like, energy starts flowing towards you. And people are like, man, I hate fucking apes. Like, if you're using the mindset of the 20th century, you're going to have a hard time understanding. What I'm saying is the apes represent the fact something is happening at a more profound level that is closer to the transcendent than you are. And the energy that's flowing to it is an indicator that it's tuning into the transcendent in a unique way. It's manifesting according to artifacts that our minds are identifying that are coming from this older place. It has an inertial guidance, like an inertial structure. But the point is, it's closer. Right? It has more vibe. It has more art. Right? It's more close to the nature of art. Right? The nature of art was never and shall never be a painting. Right? It's not a song. Right? The nature of art is to tune into the transcendent and to be one who's an agent of the logos into world. And that's more and more. Right? So this next phase, which will be like 7 years, this is going to be a weird thing. I'm proposing that this next phase, the whole sort of blockchain phase, it ain't long. Right? It rises, shakes the shit out of old post-industrial capitalism, shifts a lot of energy to new places, and then is replaced. And maybe it's 10, 15 years, but it's not a full generation. singularity, man. Things are moving fast.
Totally.
But
That's
keep
right
in
on
mind.
schedule, by the way.
Yeah, right on schedule. Yeah, exactly. That's got much better timing than we've got. Can set our watch by that.
Holy fuck.
We got to pay attention to apes with a sense of the transcendent, you know.
Hey, man. What else is there in the universe?
Exactly.
Apes with clothes. This is Jim Rutt's metaphor. Remember, when you're sitting in a boardroom, you're sitting around with a bunch of apes with clothes. Guess
That's right.
what?
Yeah.
Guess what the universe threw at us? Apes with clothes. And it couldn't be simpler. You just got to learn how to listen.
Right. That's right. And then the list of the ones that are stuck in their egoic justifications and the ones that can connect to transcendence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And
All right, guys. Nice
Hey,
first
man.
call.
great conversation.
Hey,
Thank
I'm
you,
really
everybody.
glad. Thank you, Jordan, for connecting. Zach, it's been
Yeah,
great.
great to meet you
and,
as well.
Look
Right on.
forward to more weaves here in this transcendent space.
Killer. Bye-bye.
Rock on.